And we're very excited to have with us this evening one of my favorite journalists, the ever entertaining Mark Leibovich, who's here to talk about his revealing, amusing, and ultimately quite alarming new book, Thank You for Your Servitude, Donald Trump's Washington and the Price of Submission. Now, Mark has enjoyed a distinguished career in journalism with some of the nation's best newspapers and publications. After starting with the Phoenix in Boston and the San Jose Mercury in California, he landed here in D.C. with the Washington Post, where he spent a decade, then joined the New York Times in 2006 as a national political correspondent working out of the Washington Bureau. It became clear that one of Mark's particular talents was profiling political and media figures. In fact, he won a National Magazine Award in 2011 for profiling the life and times of fellow journalist Mike Allen, then with Politico. The following year, Mark became chief national correspondent for the New York Times Sunday magazine, where he had a great run for nearly a decade until last December, when he left to start a new job writing for The Atlantic. He's also the author of 3 previous books, including the #1 bestseller 9 years ago, This Town, about the political culture of Washington. That book was wonderfully witty, incisive, gossipy, a cynical takedown of Washington's power elite, and it reinforced Mark's reputation, in the words of an NPR reviewer, as a wicked satirical talent. In his new book, Mark employs much the same talent in lampooning a number of Donald Trump's key enablers in the Republican establishment. People like Kevin McCarthy, Lindsey Graham, Rudy Giuliani, and other slavish devotees. Drawing on interviews with many of those he features, Mark frequently uses their own words to explore why they facilitated, or at least tolerated, so much of Trump's depravity in office, and in the process allowed themselves and their party to spiral down into sycophancy and cowardice. But while Mark's skewering of his subjects and his many entertaining turns of phrase offer much to chuckle about, the underlying message of his book this time is deadly serious. He concludes on a note of considerable foreboding. The fringe, he observes, has become the standard. And looking ahead, he says it's hard to foresee the next Republican majority in Congress ushering in a sober period of reflection, pragmatism, and mutual benefit. So on that happy chord, please join me in welcoming Mark Leibovich.
Thank you, Brad. It's a great beach read. You'll laugh. It's like, despite the last part of the introduction. Thank you all for coming. Wow, you don't know who's going to show up in these COVID days, so this is great. So thank you for being here, everyone. It is the Politics and Prose is the ultimate home game for me. I love coming here. I feel like, I've grown up here. My kids have grown up here. Ever since we've lived in D.C. for the last 20 years, this has been very much a second home, and it's always been like the go-to place, when I've had books, but also just to bring my kids and our family and, the cafe and everything. And I'm just so pleased to be here, and also to see how it's evolved and has thrived under Lissa and Brad, and everyone buy your books here. And, one of the things when I come here, there's always like a back and forth in my head. Like, should I read to people? Should I read from the book? And I never really love reading from the books. Because I feel like, a library teacher, and people should be sitting on floors, and everyone's in 3rd grade. I figure if people wanted to be read to, they'd get the book on tape. So if you get the book on tape, that is available, I assume, through PNP on the website, right? Okay, don't buy it through Amazon. So buy the book on tape if you want to be read to. I'm not going to read to you. Unless you want to, I'll do it privately. So thank you for being here. It's always a great experience to sort of be alone with this thing that you don't know if you're going to finish, and then be able to talk about it finally. This is a book that was not fun to write. It was not easy to write. And one of the central challenges of writing a book is trying to, you always have to expend a great deal of effort to make it look effortless, to make it look enjoyable. But the Trump years were not, for a journalist, fun to live through, which is a bit of a misconception, because people would always come up to me and say, "Oh, you must be having a blast in Washington. You know, the circus is in town. You're getting so much great copy, and Donald Trump is so colorful, and there's so much news." And I never really got that memo. I always thought that it was a darkly serious presidency. It was not fun to be made into the enemy of the people. It was not fun to be at the New York Times Washington bureau and have new armed security guards, installed after a couple of years. It made me realize in a very kind of converse way that I didn't fully appreciate before how much I cared. And that's an interesting thing that I never expected to be saying, because I have a reputation of being a bit of a cynic, with this town and books that, do take a fairly cynical eye towards politics. And I come to that honestly, and I stand by my cynicism in many cases. But if there was a kind of perverse message or surprise for me about covering these last few years, it's that I actually do care, and I actually feel more patriotic, and I feel like the stakes have never been higher. I'm also a big cheerleader for journalism. I'm a big, I will certainly talk to and maybe not even try to defend a lot of the journalism that's gone on the last few years, but I am in awe of some of the investigative work, spot news work, sort of short-term White House reporting, tweeting, essays. I've had more common cause with conservatives than I've had ever, mostly never Trump conservatives. And what I wanted to do here is write a book that was about Donald Trump's Washington, but was not about Donald Trump himself. Difficult needle to thread. A lot has been written about Donald Trump. A lot of stories have been told about Donald Trump. Books have been written about Donald Trump. More books will be written about Donald Trump. Some of them will be good books. Some of them I won't read. Many of them I have read and weren't very good books. But some of them have been very good, and there's obviously a lot to the man, and I don't really want to add to that. I feel like there's a great body of work about what went on in the White House. I think many books have brought the story forward about, here are 10 more incredible anecdotes about Donald Trump feeding dog food to Mike Pence, or hanging Jeff Sessions over the Truman balcony by the ankles, or something like that. I don't really play that game. I wanted to try to write a book through the perspective of the underappreciated, undercovered part of this Washington iteration, which is the people who allowed him to happen, the enablers, the Republican Party, the people who basically, with some exceptions, but were largely derelict in their responsibility to check and balance him, to walk away if needed. These are the Kevin McCarthys, these are the Lindsey Grahams, these are the Rudys, these are the Marco Rubios and Ted Cruzes, and people who, over a 4 or 5 year period, basically waved the white flag and allowed him to run fairly roughshod over a lot of our institutions. So the working title of this book as I was working on it was They All Knew Better, because they did. I talked to all of them, pretty much. One of the defining strains of all of these conversations was that there was always a major, major gap between what they were saying privately, contemptuously often, about the president, and what they were saying publicly, which was adulation, which was, complete capitulation, submission, whatever you want to call it. One of the challenges of this book, by the way, was finding fun synonyms for words like this. My favorite, by the way, was the brigade, the dutiful brigade of Republican turd polishers. That was from Charlie Sykes of the Bulwark, and I shout him out in the book for being the author of that. But no, this was the central dynamic of the Republican Party over these years. I tried to tell a story about a 6-year period in Washington through the lens of this sort of steady capitulation. And one of the interesting characters in this book was not actually a person, it was a place. The recurring sort of leitmotif of this book is the Trump Hotel. Has anyone ever been to the Trump Hotel? Wow, it's more than I actually would have thought. The Trump Hotel opened in late 2016, the Trump International Hotel. It was the local property. It was a beautiful hotel. I will say it. I didn't think I would say this, but it's in the old post office building. It's halfway between the White House and the Capitol on Pennsylvania Avenue. This glorious, like 4 or 5-star hotel, which for about a 5-year period was the capital of Republican Washington. It was Rick's American Cafe. It was Cheers for the Trump world, except instead of like Norm and Sam sort of giving each other crap about like Norm's tab, they would be like talking about, I don't know, some lobbying deal for a Saudi, or like, a $20,000 bar tab for someone who wanted a pardon. I mean, it was like, oh my God, gambling is going on here. Do you believe it? I'm shocked. But it was like that. It was an incredible bazaar, Bazaar. It was bizarre too. But you would have, dozens of Republican congressmen and women, mostly men, at all hours at the bar, running up huge tabs, often Instagramming their tabs and making sure that the White House knew about it. So the president could see that Congressman so-and-so had spent $20,000 on a bottle of champagne, and it goes right to the president's bottom line. It sounds like a joke, but it actually happened. You had the president's cabinet. You had members of the White House staff. You had members of the administration. You had Rudy. You had Rudy. I'd see Rudy going out to smoke a cigar with his undone tie and often red wine staining his white shirt. I think that was the night of the Mnuchin wedding. Steve Mnuchin, the Secretary of the Treasury, had a place there for a while. His wife had a little purse dog that she carried with her all over the place. Rudy himself had a place there. You had a lot of members of the press there. We get a lot of work done there. You could see White House officials after a rough day, often not having fun doing what they were doing, ready to commiserate. A lot of them were drinking. This is not the kind of place I would want to spend a lot of time left to my own devices. I'd probably rather spend my time after work pretty much anywhere else, except, or maybe go home or something like a normal person would do. But it was unlike anything I'd ever seen covering Washington over the last 25 years. And it was the ultimate scene. And I remember people would ask, always, especially when I'd leave town, God, what's it like there? What's it like back in Washington? And I would always sort of settle on this scene. And the ultimate part of the scene was that, maybe 30 or 40 times in the course of his presidency at least, the president himself would come into the Trump Hotel. Donald Trump would agree to eat at exactly one establishment in all of Washington outside of the White House, and that was the steakhouse at the Trump Hotel. That was his place. He needed to, first of all, he was never terribly at home at the White House. He would always get restless. He was always being hassled, he felt. He needed the big applauded entrance. He needed people to be standing on chairs chanting his name. He needed to wave. He needed cameras. He needed a fuss. He needed his 40-ounce tomahawk steak, well done. He needed his shrimp cocktail, his French fries, and his chocolate cake for dessert, sometimes apple pie, and always a bucket of chilled Diet Coke because, the diet. Got to be careful of the diet. Got to take care of himself. So he would, it was just quite a scene, and you'd have like these anthropological people like me and other journalists, and sometimes even people who hated Trump, who would just go in on the hope that maybe you'd get to see Cinderella coming into the castle, himself. You'd have tourists in from Tennessee, and they would expect, like, okay, you go to Disney World, you don't expect to see Cinderella herself, but at least we'll get a few pictures of the castle. But wow, there he is. And he'd come in, and they would chant his name. And there'd be these paparazzi, and they'd be asking him, like, what'd you have for dinner, Mr. President? And he'd look in the eye and say, steak. That'd be it. Bizarre, right? So this was the Paola Palace. That's what I called it. Some people, there was all these nicknames that the Trump Hotel regulars had for the place. Headquarters, the home office, the America's living room was another one. I called it the Paola Palace. So you go through there, and that was sort of the center of Washington. But one of the but it was a very poignant scene in some ways, because you'd see Lindsey Graham going from table to table, Kevin McCarthy going from table to table, being thanked for all of the great things they were doing for our great president. And a guy like Lindsey Graham, who knows better, very, savvy veteran senator, best friends of John McCain, who loved alpha dogs, loved hanging around with the alpha dogs. John McCain for many years, his own father for many years in a bar that his own family ran in South Carolina, and then Donald Trump, who he kind of glommed onto not long after John McCain died, or even before John McCain died, and would follow him on the golf course. They'd be golfing all the time. He'd be on the phone with him all the time. He'd be advertising, I just got off the phone with the president. McCarthy would do that. They all would do that. And they all knew better. Again, privately, and I have a lot of this on the record, they would say, man, this is a tightrope. It's really stressful. Graham was extremely open about the game he was playing, about how he was sort of playing Donald Trump, and how, well, if you really want to get something out of him, just tell him Obama will do the opposite. And don't flatter him too much. Only flatter him 80% of the way, because he'll work for that last 20%. You can get what you want, and you can do a deal. It was stunning. Lindsey made the calculation that, his voters in South Carolina are not going to read the New York Times, and they're not going to read this book. I assume he's right. And he just did it. And I think if he did and Trump found out about it, he wouldn't care. He liked the idea that he was being talked about. So, I try to move through time in this book while telling the stories of these people who, again, kind of learned to make the Trump years work for them. Whether it's just getting reelected, whether it's getting onto the golf course with the president, whether it's getting to be Speaker of the House, which is pretty much all Kevin McCarthy wants at this point. And they all need Donald Trump's blessing to do that. So fast forward to the end of the administration. Would that it have been that easy? The Trump Hotel was pretty much a ghost town after COVID, like most hotels, like most establishments. COVID basically ruined the business, and then Trump did something unforgivably off-brand, which is he lost. And it was not a lot of people were coming around much anymore. No one was there. I'd still stop in periodically, like through 2021 and early 2022, just to sort of get the flavor of the ghost towning of the Trump Hotel. Occasionally you'd see a Madison Cawthorn or a Lauren Boebert or a Marjorie Taylor Greene in the place. They were like really the only people who were hanging around. So it was sort of a sign of the times. And then late in 2021, the Trump organization sold the property to a Miami investment group for $100 million profit, which is another very familiar Washington story, which is failing upward, right? It's this basically scorned and abandoned property sells for a huge profit for the owner. Granted, it's great location, beautiful building, so you can see why it would be desirable for someone. But at the same time, the profiteer here is someone who left office in utter disgrace, impeached twice, lost the House, the Senate, the White House, the only first president in 100 years to do that, first president in 150 years ever not to be invited to his successor's inauguration. If you want to pander to Republicans, you can say, he lost to Joe Biden. Not easy to do. Probably a lot of people like Joe Biden here, but, it's like there's every reason for Republicans to run away from him. And for some reason, they're too scared to. And I don't know why, but because of this, because they're continuing to enable him, he will probably run for president again in 2024. And, I assume if he does, he'll be a pretty clear front runner to win the nomination again. And then who knows what's going to happen. So, again, Republicans are complicit here. They could have stopped this. They could stop this. And it is not like there has been a shortage of courage around the rest of the world. In a non-political context, Ukraine, right? The resistance is real and noble and, inspiring to watch. Even the Conservative Party in England, they have rose up. They said, enough is enough, Boris Johnson, you're gone. These incredibly brave men and women many of whom who worked for Donald Trump in the White House, coming before the January 6th committee at great risk to themselves, despite threats, what have you, revenge, and also the outliers like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and Mitt Romney and not a lot of others. But, there are examples of this which do inspire me, and sometimes when I speak a little bit too enthusiastically about how inspired I am by the Liz Cheneys of the world, I kind of get looked askance, from people who say, oh, but what about her father and the Iraq War and so forth, or look what Mitt Romney did in 2012 when he was running against. So I'm of the belief that it's never too late to do the right thing and to stand up for something as precious as democracy. And I hope that things turn. I have real doubts that the Republican Party at this moment has the fortitude and the will and frankly the courage to do anything about what they all consider privately to be the existential problem for their party, because it's not conservative. It's been disastrous in many ways. It could cost us dearly as a democracy. And that sounds heavy. Again, I've been very encouraged that people seem to be laughing on every page. I think there's a lot of unmined ridicule, scorn towards a lot of these figures that has been underutilized, and I try to bring it to life in a lively and fun way. But yeah, it is deathly serious, and I do cop to being a much more, I guess maybe much less cynical figure, much more maybe, again, perversely idealistic figure in thinking about the country and thinking about what the stakes are, because I think it's very important. I left the New York Times about 6 months ago, and I loved the New York Times. I had 16 great years there, and before that, 9 great years with the Washington Post. And they were, I loved working for 2 great newspapers. Institutionally, it was a very, heady and weighty and actually kind of pressure-filled activity and place to work. But I also feel like I'm at a new stage in my career where I am now writing more, I don't know about freely, but I do feel like it's at a moment where the stakes are higher, and I am sort of using a new voice. And I think that I try out a lot of this here that, unfortunately was executed during difficult times and also during a pandemic, and it was cold, and I was between jobs, and I was probably not a lot of fun to be around, as my family can attest. My wife's shaking her head in the back. But again, having said all that, I do think it's a fun book. I hope you'll read it. I also hope you'll ask questions, because I, as a print reporter, much more enjoy interactive formats and sort of being able to hone in on what people are actually interested in rather than trying to wing it from a microphone. So, but most of all, thank you to Brad and Lissa and Politics and Prose, and thank you all for being here. And I'll take your questions. And go to the mic, and then I'll take your question. If you can't get to the mic for some reason, just shout out the question and I'll repeat it. So, we need you to go to the mics if possible. Can you go to the mics, or here, or sorry. All right. Excellent. Why don't we do here? Come on up. We'll do you first, and then Cal will go second. So, thanks for efforting to do this here. It'll be worth it.
I'm not going under that cord.
No, I know. There you go. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
Don't want you to trip.
Thanks.
No,
Thank you.
C-SPAN's here, by the way, so, yeah, that's it. C-SPAN's here. That's good.
First of all, very enjoyable book.
Thank you.
Recommend it.
Thanks.
And I just wondered if you could talk for a few minutes about, just the big joke and the cost for people of the big
Yeah.
joke.
It's a great question. It's one of my favorite recurring sort of features in the book. And so there's an expression in Washington called, well, so-and-so gets the joke. And I remember it was first used when I was reporting on This Town, when a Democratic lobbyist said, oh, well, my lobbying partner, who was a Republican lobbyist, he gets the joke. And finally he said this enough, and it was actually Jack Quinn, who was the White House counsel under Bill Clinton, and his lobbying partner was Ed Gillespie, who ran for governor and a couple of other offices in Virginia, and he was, he's a sort of high-level Republican operative. And finally I asked Jack. I said, "What is the joke? What is this you keep saying?" And he would say, "Well, it's like the unspoken thing that we all know, but we don't really say." I'm like, "Well, what is that?" And this was 10 years ago. And he said, "Well, basically that we're all, I might be a Democrat and Ed might be a Republican, but we're all kind of in business together, and we all kind of know what the deal is here, which is we're all getting rich." So that's the joke. So the joke has since evolved. The joke is whatever the unspoken truth that people do not say on the record happens to be at the moment. In the Republican Party, in most cases, the joke was that the guy who is leading our party, that we all pledge utter allegiance to, is himself a joke, is someone we don't have respect for, we think is not fit to be president. At worst, he's a criminal, he's criminally dangerous. I mean, again, they all knew that, and yet whatever power they had, they refused to use. So that, in this Trump context, was very sad, but it was the joke, and I heard it again and again and again. So, yeah.
Great. So on the way up here, I was actually looking back to your profile of Chris Christie, and I'm glad that the question was asked about the joke, because you mentioned that Chris Christie seemed to get the joke, right?
Absolutely.
Back in 2014.
Yep.
One line stood out, though, which is that you quoted him as saying that he went to a donors convention, right? And he was big on swagger, low on substance.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, right, at what point that changed, right, from 2014, where Republicans put a premium, I guess, on substance and not swagger, where they nominated. In your reporting, what did you see?
I mean, it's funny because Christie's kind of a classic case of a guy who fairly nakedly, not literally nakedly, but fairly blatantly was happy to lay out the game. Chris Christie's a smart guy. He's very savvy. He's someone who is, frankly, he's fun to talk to. You can, he's like a political operative in some ways. He's like a wise guy, and he loves the sort of game of it. But he's also, on some levels, a very serious guy. But he's more of a game player than a serious guy. I mean, he got a lot done, or a fair amount done, as governor of New Jersey. He is the kind of person who could have given Trump a run for his money in 2016 because they were running against each other. But he basically said, all right, I'm folding my tent. And I think, Christie's basically a small-town Jersey guy who was afraid of the big bully with dyed orange hair from Queens. His big rap when he was in New Jersey was, there are two ways to deal with a bully. One is to sidle up to him, and one is to sort of smack him in the nose. And I like to smack him in the nose, which, of course, was the 180-degree opposite of what Christie actually did. So I don't know. I think Christie just didn't have the fortitude to do it. I don't know if he would change now, but I had a conversation with him a few months ago. He's out of office. He's trying to, he's a commentator. He's got consulting jobs and stuff. He's making noises about running for president again. I don't think he will do terribly well, but I don't see him as having the fortitude to take Trump on if Trump runs again, any more than he did before. So, kind of a disappointing figure ultimately.
Great, thank you.
Yep. Hi.
Hi. Thanks for providing a different spin on the enabling of the joke. But how much you've been with many of the different mainstream publications that we all follow, how much of the enabling is due to the mainstream media? Instead of, why does the mainstream media, I know it's news, give them such air?
Yeah.
Why do we not, put it where it belongs, like in the back, maybe next to the obituaries? Why does it so much air?
It's a great question. I get it a lot. I get it actually more now than after I left the New York Times, and I feel like I can answer it. I mean, I don't think I ever answered it dishonestly, but I feel freer to answer that question. I think I would say a few things. One, media is not that organized. It's not like we have a meeting at the beginning of every day. Okay, how are we going to get clicks today by putting as much Trump in the newspaper or on TV as possible? I also am of the belief that he was the Republican frontrunner for most of the 2016 campaign. He was the president of the United States. You can't wish someone away by ignoring them. I realize that the 10 crazy tweets that Donald Trump might have written overnight were all horrific and stupid and nonsensical and not deserving of any news. But on the other hand, he is the president of the United States, and this should be, it's, if he's going to say outrageous things that are actionable, that people are going to listen to, that are going to affect markets, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, offend large swaths of the population, I think it needs to be out there. I don't think it can be wished away. And I take your point. I think there is a real conversation, and an important conversation that should be had about the proportion of Donald Trump's rallies being broadcast live on CNN, that go on for hours. I mean, hours. And that happened for a fair amount of time, into the election cycle, into his presidency. I think that happened more than it should happen. I think you could definitely make a case that there was disproportionately too much attention given to the Hillary email story. I mean, that hits home for me. This is my paper. I mean, it's not like I was in those meetings and I was making those calls. But I will say, and again, I don't say it defensively, I just say it as someone who was sitting in the newsroom for all those years, is there's a lot of care and discussion and really responsibility sort of put into, whether you can use words like racist and lie on the front page of the New York Times. I think we, or the Times, back when it was we, it was easier to do after a while because it was sort of beyond argument, right? But yeah, I mean, I don't pretend that they got that right or we got that right every day.
No, thanks. That was all fair, but
Yeah.
as I can understand while he was president
Yeah.
that he gets all the air. But why now, and why when he was in campaigning?
Yeah.
I mean, you're still getting all this air now for his craziness.
I think he's the front runner. I think he's the front runner for the Republican Party. I don't think he's getting as much air as he used to. I mean, partly because he doesn't have a Twitter account. But I mean, I get it. I mean, a lot of it is nonsense. But look, I mean, he's the most coveted endorsement in the Republican Party. I mean, people are going down there to kiss his ring. I mean, ridiculously. I mean, think about this, by the way. I mean, when Jimmy Carter got blown out by Ronald Reagan in 1980, Democrats weren't going down to Plains, Georgia to kiss his ring, to get his blessing. I mean, when George Herbert Walker Bush lost to Bill Clinton in 1992, it's not like Republicans were going up to Kennebunkport saying, please endorse me. I mean, this is a whole different animal. And you could say, well, maybe because the media spends so much time building him up. I just think it's a product of his complete force of personality, shamelessness, and the Republicans' unwillingness just to cut him loose, which I think they can do now, but they're not. So, are we getting that right every day? Maybe, maybe not. But, I still think it's important to sort of put what people who could be president are saying out there. So,
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Thanks.
In the last few days, there have been reports that Rupert Murdoch has begun criticizing Trump's handling of January 6th.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say something about the role of the Murdochs in this whole scheme of things? Are they trying to control Trump, or are they just being used like everybody else?
Probably a little of both. That's a good question. I mean, first of all, I think the impetus for people having this discussion now has been basically a single editorial in the New York Post, which is his tabloid in New York, which the Murdoch family owns. I think the impact and the power of Fox News and the primetime lineup on Fox News is about 1,000 times greater. And I think until Fox News turns against Donald Trump, he's got a great, chance of sort of surviving and getting rehabilitated through everything. I'm of the belief that Richard Nixon probably could have survived Watergate if he had Fox News at his disposal, if he had, and not to mention someone like Kevin McCarthy. And I mean, I do think Fox News is a game-changing, resource for Republican presidents who stay on his right side. And yeah, are they using each other? Probably, because the ratings are great. The Fox viewers love Trump pretty much. He's entertaining. There's a theory that the Murdochs want to move to Ron DeSantis. I'm dubious because I don't think Ron DeSantis would be as good box office, and ultimately the Murdochs are extremely cynical business people, and they want ratings, and they don't really care what the, from what I can tell, they don't care what the effect on, our government and our society is. So I don't know. I'm dubious. I also think that the second Trump, sort of flexes his muscles. If Rupert's still alive, he'll follow along, and if Rupert's kids are, I don't see that changing anytime soon. So that's just me. Hi.
I consider that Trump criminally sent people into action to do violence and potentially murder.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything from his past where he has done that kind of thing, not directly, but encouraged people to act to violence?
He's a pretty amoral character. Wouldn't surprise me. I mean, and he's also overcome. He's survived a lot. Whether it's by just sort of using the law to his advantage, or just just lawyering up, or just litigating up, and what have you. I mean, I don't pretend to know what the Justice Department is thinking when they see this, but as a viewer, I've consistently been just flabbergasted by this, and I just keep asking myself, is that legal? Isn't that, how is that allowed? It's just, I get why not every little thing is prosecutable. I get why, Kellyanne Conway running up, hatch violations like parking tickets is not, getting the prime attention of the Justice Department. There are these sort of line stepping instances with every administration, but I don't know. I think it's pretty blatant. So whatever he's done in his past, I hope someone's taking a look at it. So, yeah.
Thank you for writing your book.
Thank you.
I think I heard you correctly that you said at one point that he could have been stopped.
I think so.
And, as I read your book, and I'm not quite finished with it, but it just seems to me that all the characters you're writing about come on singly. McCarthy needs something.
Come on up to the mic a little more.
Okay. McCarthy needs something. Graham they come on as individuals.
Yeah.
So just thinking about that, it seems to me he could have been stopped only if people joined forces.
Absolutely.
Now, what were you thinking, though?
What was I thinking about?
Yeah, that he could have been stopped.
I think he could have been stopped. Well, okay. I think he could have been stopped. Impeachment 1, maybe not. It wasn't that clear cut. It was a little complicated. And I think, look, once he's president, you get a wide berth, right? The two times when he could have been stopped were, Election Day. Election Day, within a 72-hour period, he lost. Okay, it was clear within maybe 48 hours that this was trending clearly towards Biden. The numbers were moving that way. That is traditionally when every single leader of the party falls into line. Okay, the whole the president has to, he's fully in his rights to exhaust every legal recourse or whatever. That's just absolute bullshit. And the reason they weren't lining up to do that is because they were dealing with a toddler. They were, there's this now infamous quote that ran, a blind quote that ran in the Washington Post within 48 hours of the election, where some senior White House advisor said, "Oh, what's the use in humoring him for just a little bit of time, and let him work off his steam, and then eventually he'll stop tweeting, and we can all get on with our lives." Paraphrasing, but humoring him was essentially the Republican platform, right? Still is. The literal Republican platform, as certified, inscribed, and voted upon in 2020, was whatever Donald Trump wants. It sounds like I'm paraphrasing, and I am, but it's basically 3 lines of whatever Donald Trump wants. And, they were terrified of him. They were terrified. Mitch McConnell was terrified of the January 5th runoff in Georgia. There was a Senate runoff. There were 2 Senate seats that he figured they needed to keep Trump engaged, and that's what would keep Republicans in Georgia from coming out. Trump was engaged, but he went down to Georgia at least once, I think maybe twice, and basically made it all about him. He said, "Oh, the election was stolen. Do you believe this? You know, we won the election." And, you know, when you basically tell Republicans in Georgia, you know, your vote doesn't count, it's not going to bring people to the polls, especially when the Republicans on the ballot are not named Trump. So they lost that. But they were just mostly scared. They just thought he'd go away. They thought that the problem would take care of itself. Then January 6th happens, okay? There was like a 4 or 5 day period when they could have cut him loose. Like, I mean, they could have gotten the impeachment votes, the conviction votes, I'm almost certain. But first, Mitch McConnell decided he didn't want to do this, and he definitely, despite condemning Trump in the most, you know, the strongest possible terms, he basically said, all right, we're not doing impeachment until after the inauguration. Unclear why. I mean, they could have done that in 2 days. I mean, everyone lived through it. They saw what happened. They know exactly how it started and how it got to where it did. But McConnell basically punted this till after the inauguration, and that gave everyone an easy answer. It's like, oh, why impeach a president who's no longer president? It doesn't make sense. I'm voting no. So, and then 8 days later, Kevin McCarthy goes down to Mar-a-Lago, kisses the ring. A few weeks later, Mitch McConnell says, oh, well, of course support the nominee in 2020. I mean, you know, and he's back, right? So, one of my favorite off-color, but I'm going to use it anyway, quotes in these 4 years was Susan Glasser of The New Yorker wrote a profile of Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, and she quoted someone at the State Department who said that Secretary Pompeo is like a heat-seeking missile for Donald Trump's ass. Great quote, and I reuse that as often as possible, including in the Atlantic a few weeks ago. And basically, you know, the heat-seeking missiles were launched from Washington down to Mar-a-Lago even after the posterior of the former president was rehomed to Mar-a-Lago, and it's still there. It's a really sad state of affairs, but here we are.
It's a sad state of affairs, and it's scary.
It
he
is.
seems to have this incredible power. So I think
Absolutely. There's no
I
question
continue to
about
worry
it.
about that.
Yep.
Anyway, thank you.
But enjoy the book. It's fun. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a scary situation in my mind. It's
Yeah.
very frightening that our democracy is on this precipice, really. But I was thinking about Liz Cheney, that you said to her, you know, you were, in spite of her politics, admiring her, and I certainly
Yeah.
have. I think we all have. But she's going to go down in flames, it's quite clear.
Looks that way.
So what happens then when she loses, and then she's going to be off the committee?
Not immediately. I mean, here's what I think is going to happen there. I think there's a chance she wins. I probably am wrong. I think it's unlikely. I mean, Wyoming is I think the smallest state in the country, or at least the continental U.S. It's also the Trumpiest state in the country.
Yeah.
You know, 70% of the vote in
Right.
2020. You know, Liz Cheney got more votes than Trump did, but yeah, it doesn't seem like a ideal place for her. I mean, but you know, she's getting. I mean, yeah, I think it's unlikely that she wins. I don't think that will stop her from sort of pursuing this. I think she could very well run for president, or, you know, I think Kinzinger might if she doesn't. I think, you know, I think she has made it very clear, and I admire the hell out of this, that she's playing for history. She's playing for keeps, and she's one of the very few people that I interviewed in doing this book that was willing to say that their legacy, that she thinks about her legacy. She cares about what her grandkids are going to read about in history books, about how their grandma or mother or whoever performed during these days. And I guarantee you that, you know, my grandkids, if they read up on history, Liz Cheney will come out looking a lot better than Elise Stefanik or Kevin McCarthy or any of that. Now, is that just Pollyannish Northwest Washington guy giving a book talk? Maybe, but I think that counts for something, and I think she's doing an incredible service. I think the hearings have been great. I think they've been performed really. I just think they've been not a joy, but I think they've been they've been very effective, and I hope they continue. And look, I mean, yeah, I think if Republicans win the House, that thing's going to probably disband pretty quickly. But
Yeah.
but they're, you know, once the truth gets rolling, it's kind of hard to stop. And you know, the Justice Department still has some time to do their work. And
What do you think the chances are of Pence being able to stand up against?
not good. No, I don't see him doing it. I mean, I think I'm sort of amazed. I remember watching the last hearings and seeing hearing the radio voices of his Secret Service detail
Yeah.
actually talking about saying goodbye to their families,
Right.
and I'm thinking, Pence, if he's watching this and he can't just like go up and testify before the committee, like he did the bare minimum on January 6th, which was important. I don't want to undervalue that at all. I think even the bare minimum in a moment of truth is important, but I'd love to see Mike Pence sort of step out of his role a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
No.
If he could testify.
Yeah. Anyone else? Ooh. Hi.
Hi. Sorry, I'm just going to ask the obvious. I don't get it. I'm confused. I'm befuddled. I do not understand where he gets the power. Does he have like the goods on everybody? Is it like J. Edgar Hoover? Does he have
Yeah.
does he know who's gay and in the closet or what? I mean, really, like once he left, how can he still I don't get it.
Oh,
I'm
so-
completely
Yeah. Yeah.
Really, and I think many of us are sort of stunned. Like, how is it that nobody has the balls to slap him down? Is it that we are all, or they are all intimidated by a tweet, and they're afraid to be made fun of, and nobody wants to look stupid? Or, I mean, it's just sort of stunning to me that nobody.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe you know the answer to that.
Oh, I
You've
totally
been
know the
studying
answer.
Him,
No,
you've got a book on it. You got the whole thing.
I'm
so.
ready. I'm ready with my answer here. No, actually bait and switch. I don't really know, but I think I will say this. Even though this isn't a Trump book, I spent a fair amount of time with him during the 2016 campaign, and it got old pretty quickly. I got a lot of access to him. I got a lot of he's one thing about him, especially early on. He allowed himself to be seen, in cars and his apartments and golf courses and holding rooms and everywhere, planes. And I saw his effect on people, mainly his supporters. That's a superpower, to be able to hold a very loyal segment of the population and sort of control those voters, and that scares Republicans who need those votes. But he also said something to me early on that I have not forgot, which is we were heading back from a debate at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California in late 2015. And it was one of those things where there's probably about a dozen people on stage, and he totally stole the show. He was insulting people. He wasn't making a lot of sense, but he got maybe 80% of the attention and questions, and he was right in the center stage. And he said to me, I'm going to win. I'm going to win because I have a skill, and that is I can sense weakness in people, and I can identify it, and I can exploit it. Very self-aware for him. And those people on the stage with me, they're pretty weak. They're going to come around to me. I'm just going to keep pushing, and it might take some a while. It might take Ted Cruz a while. It might take Little Marco a while. It might take Jeb a while, but they'll come around because I'm just going to take, and I'm just going to take it. I'm just going to win, and I'm not going to really care. And so he's got a few superpowers. One, he's got the spell over his voters, and two, he's got shamelessness. Shamelessness creates a kind of asymmetrical warfare, right? I remember interviewing Hillary right before the election, maybe 3-4 weeks before the election in Toledo, Ohio. And she is, she's an amazingly thoughtful person to talk to one-on-one. It's a cliche, and it doesn't come out enough, and that's a whole other story. But, she has a really good sense of things and of people and of how they are playing and so forth. And she, at one point, we were pretty late in our discussion, and she was tired, and everyone was like, oh, Hillary's going to win. There's no way she can lose. And, she clearly looked worn down, and she had pneumonia maybe about a few weeks earlier, and it was still kind of feeling the effects. But she said, I said, so you ever get, nervous about this? Because, look, you're, on the precipice of being the first woman president, and, history, and, you've wanted this your whole life, and it looks great, and he just did this Access Hollywood thing. I mean, how can? And he said, I don't go there. She said, I don't go there. And I said, what do you mean? She goes, well, and it looked like she was not enjoying contemplating this. It looked like she was probably contemplating something she might have had a sixth sense about, which is the incredible burden on the person running against Donald Trump, losing. Like, she could be not only the person who loses the presidency, but the person who loses the presidency to Donald Trump. And she said at one point, if I were running against Mitt Romney, I mean, yeah, we'd have our differences, but I wouldn't have a pit in my stomach every night. And she wouldn't think about defeat, but it was clear that she was, when I was sort of pressing her on it, she was thinking about what it might mean if this didn't go well. And I think she probably knew on some level that what Trump had was not being fully measured by the polls. I mean, anyone who was like in Trump's orbit knew that there was something there that might not be counted. I mean, there was just block after block of supporters, and it was like, wow, this is unlike anything I've seen. And she looked at me as I was leaving, and she said, just remember, I'm the last thing standing between you and the apocalypse, which I thought was, good sound effect, right? I was like, we planned it just like that. Train whistle in the background. But so, and that was actually the last line of the story. I think they made it the headline of the story. This is hilarious. There we go. So this was, it was the headline of the piece. And I remember actually talked to her for another story about maybe a year ago. And I said, Madam Secretary, I haven't talked to you since Toledo, Ohio, October of 2016, and the last thing you said to me was, I'm the last thing standing between you and the apocalypse. And, I happened to quote you on that, and I put it in the paper, and it was the front of the New York Times Magazine. So, yeah, you warned us. And she said, yeah, you shouldn't. You know what? I've been meaning to tell you this. See, I told you. And it was kind of funny, but not that funny. Anyway. I forgot how we got there, but he had something. There was something. It was that whole campaign was out of whack, and I think he still has whatever that is. He still has it. It might not be real, but it won't be real until someone fights against it. So, hi.
That was probably a good place to stop, but if you don't mind, one more question.
Sure.
I appreciate what you say about his shamelessness, and I appreciate what you say about his ability to cash in on people's weaknesses.
Yeah.
But I think basically, and this is my thesis, that the reason why he has a lot of support is that it's basically a racist agenda. And we have a lot of racism that he has tapped into that people don't want to talk about, whether it's how he humiliated Obama about the birth certificate and everything else he's done. Yeah. How much of his agenda, his racist agenda, do you think? I think that's the 35% that he gets.
Look, there's a lot wrapped up in that. I think, I will say this. Without making a judgment on all of his supporters and whether they're racist or not. I mean, I think people are complicated, but I would say this. I think I wouldn't underestimate the level of resentment that a lot of his supporters have to, frankly, people like us, people who they feel don't share their values, people who they feel have contempt for them, people that they feel, I mean, again, everyone's different, but there was something that always stuck out for me. There's a conservative theorist, very controversial conservative theorist named Charles Murray, who wrote an essay about Trump's appeal. And basically the thesis of his essay was a lot of Trump supporters don't want to defend him. They don't particularly want their kids to grow up to be like him. They don't want to emulate him. But what they love about him is he's a murder weapon. He actually won. He actually was the Republican who, for the first time in a long time, won an election. And through him, they could exact revenge. Again, very simplistic. It's generalizing. But I think there's a lot to the notion that Trump pissed off a lot of people that they really hated. They being his supporters. And I think it goes far beyond, racist or illiberal views that many of them might hold. I think that's probably part of it. I think, you can't underestimate race on any cultural issue in America right now or ever. But I think there's a lot going on. So, hi.
Hello. Just wonder, what are your thoughts on Joe Biden so far? Do you think he's succeeded in lowering the temperature in Washington after the Trump years? And do you expect him to serve a second term?
He hasn't lowered the temperature. It's hot as hell outside. So Biden is unfortunately, I wrote a piece for The Atlantic about a month ago saying essentially, well, not essentially, explicitly, that he's too old and he shouldn't run again. It was a little controversial, but I stand by it. I think the problem with Joe Biden is that he peaked in November of 2020. I mean, he will not perform a more important service to America than he did in November of 2020. And, and then unfortunately he had to go serve out a 4-year term in the midst of a pandemic with all kinds of, derangement and divisions in the country. And I think he did calm the thing down. I mean, he wasn't tweeting like a madman. He gave a, pretty good inauguration speech. Then he went into a spiral. I mean, Afghanistan. And look, I'm of the belief that if he stepped aside and said, look, it's time to sort of turn this party over to the next generation, let the bench out a little bit, whoever it is. I think the bench will probably come into some focus after the midterms if a couple of candidates like maybe John Fetterman in Pennsylvania or Tim Ryan in Ohio do well, Stacey Abrams in Georgia, whoever. I mean, I think, but I would really love to see some new blood and some new ideas and someone younger than maybe 60 trying to do this. I don't covet the thought of a Biden-Trump rematch at all. I don't know a lot of people who do. Yeah, I think it would be a great time for him to step aside, or maybe wait till after the midterms if he wanted to do that. But it's one man's decision, so it's not mine. So, anyone else? Yeah, I'd love to sign some books. Oop, we have one more question.
Thank you so much, if I may.
Yeah.
I haven't read the book, but it sounds amazing.
Read the book and get back to me.
I will
No.
read the book. I promise. One thing you said earlier that really caught my interest is that you've interviewed a lot of these people directly, and you find them to be very intelligent,
Not always.
and also that they candidly admit to you that they privately completely disagree with him. And I'm just wondering, people like Lindsey Graham or Chris Christie, do they think about the potential for him to become something like Hitler if he gets reelected? And how do they answer those kind of hypotheticals? How do they reconcile that?
This is how they answer hypothetical questions. I don't answer hypothetical questions. No, look, I mean, first of all, they agree with a lot of stuff. They don't have a lot of respect for the person. I mean, it's like there's a difference between, I mean, they get a lot of their policy agenda. I mean, they get their judges, they get their tax cut. I mean, they get a lot of their deregulation. I mean, there is some, there's quite a bit of Republican goodies that Donald Trump has provided for the party. I don't think privately they like Graham and Christie don't really respect his intelligence. They don't like the chaos. They don't like I think they're probably troubled by the anti-democratic bent and so forth. But yeah, they don't. I mean, as far as I would get from them on the record is, Lindsey Graham would be like. Lindsey had this really annoying way of doing the sort of this, what's the word? Keystone Cops response. Like, oh, he's so incompetent. He could never have colluded with the Russians, right? He's never run for city council. How is he going to, figure out how to rig an election with, I mean, so he was always like, I remember once someone asked Graham in a press gaggle, does it bother you that Donald Trump lies all the time? And he goes, "Nah, we all accused him of lying during the primaries." I'm like, okay. I mean, it was always kind of a glib sort of answer, and I think to a person, and there's a whole bunch of examples of this in the book. I mean, they don't let themselves talk about history. They are either so shallow or so scared or so dismissive of the question. They believe that anything that gets in the way of the short-term expediency of keeping Donald Trump happy in the day-to-day or getting to their next election is not worth their time, and maybe they're too ashamed to contemplate it, but never really got very far. So I remember once actually I asked Kevin McCarthy, I said, so do you worry about, history or like how you'll be remembered? And he said, oh, you mean the Jeff Flake thing? And I mean, what do you mean? He goes, Jeff Flake is a senator from Arizona, objected to Trump, significantly, spoke out against him, basically lost his viability. And, McCarthy's point was, where's the statue to Jeff Flake in the House, So what's he doing now? Like, he's not in office, so I don't want to wind up like him and so forth. You would think. He's also ambassador to Austria, so, Joe Biden appointed him. So anyway, thank you all for coming. This was a really great series of questions, and I'm happy to sign your books. And as always, thanks to PNP and support PNP. Thanks. Sure.